The views in this podcast are those of the contributors and don't necessarily represent those of CISL, the University of Cambridge or Investec, and should not be taken as advice or a recommendation. Welcome to What Next? Leadership Conversations for a Better Future from the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership in partnership with Investec. This series is hosted by Lindsay Hooper and Mark Kahn.
Hello and welcome to What Next? Leadership Conversations for a Better Future, where we explore how leaders can help build future-fit economies. I'm Lindsay Hooper, Chief Executive at the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership.
And I'm Mark Kahn, Chief Strategy and Sustainability Officer at Investec. Together, we'll bring fresh perspectives, provocative questions, and conversations with leaders who are shaping the future of markets, business, and society.
Public sector support for climate and energy transitions is becoming more volatile, and even practical cost-saving measures can meet resistance, never mind some of the more challenging shifts that may be needed. For leaders, this raises a major question. How do you build political, economic, social support for change at the scale required that's in the interests of businesses, economies and societies? Today, we're joined by two people who've been thinking about this from very different angles. Michael Liebright brings an energy systems perspective that's grounded in data, economics and political realism. And Rory Sutherland famously brings behavioural insights into how people make decisions. Both guests have engaged publicly and provocatively on these issues, and today we want to build on that and explore the broader question of how societies form or lose buy-in for the transitions necessary to tackle the challenge of climate change. Welcome, Michael and Rory.
It's really great to speak to you both. Thank you for joining us. Maybe I can start with you, Michael. You argue that, quote, rumours of the death of the energy transition are greatly exaggerated. And we think that that's a very sensible statement. And we'd like to just get a perspective from you on how do you position us on the curve now?
Let me clarify that statement. That comes from a piece that I wrote called The Pragmatic Climate Reset. Now, what I was responding to was a flood of sort of commentator articles and thought pieces saying that the transition was never going to happen and it isn't happening, and indeed it can't happen, that we've seen the addition of some wind and solar, but it's additive and that there's no transition. What I did was I said, well, if you think the transition, the definition of it is a dramatic and very fast fall in the use of fossil fuels, which is what all the activists and for the last 10 years kind of the discourse has said, that's what we have to do. If that's your only definition of a transition, then yeah, it's dead because it's not happening. You can see that. But my argument is that was never a realistic model. That's just not how new industries
It's not how transitions happen in any shape or form. Not how transitions
happen. So you start doing the clean things and then you grow them and grow them. There comes a point when they are big enough to kind of absorb all of the growth in energy demand, and we're pretty much there now. And as they continue to grow, they will start forcing fossil off the system, but it will take decades. And I built this minuscule model, 4-line model, to illustrate exactly how that works. And what it essentially says is that it doesn't prove we are in a transition. We know that because we can see what's happening with wind, with solar, with batteries, with electric cars, with the fact that China's emissions have actually seemed to have peaked and so on. So something's happening. The model just shows what happens if it continues. And if it continues, then the transition, is alive and at least wriggling, if not kicking.
The misunderstanding is that a transition is a kind of switch off, switch on. And the real appreciation is that as a new technology emerges, there's a parallel usage that happens, and there's a kind of slow but meaningful increase in the new technology and decrease in the old. And we see that in China, is not pulled back necessarily on fossil fuel-based
A helpful
activities.
analogy might be you don't measure the growth and significance of mobile telephony by the decline in landline ownership.
Yes.
I mean, that would be my kind of analogy. Now, my children don't have landlines, okay? I still do. And the simple fact is that there is always, every transition effectively is a kind of handover.
Right.
It's not a one-for-one replacement.
I'm fascinated to know what you do with your landline, because I haven't had one for a decade.
No, absolutely right. I might make a point that there's an advantage to the landline, which is sometimes you want to ring a place, not a person. I'm going to defend the landline, but that is not. Do not interpret that as a corresponding defence of fossil fuels.
Okay. So the point being, I think that you're right. It is transition as a sort of rapid ramp down and a rapid ramp up. And of course, in retrospect, we look at transitions like the shift from coal to oil in shipping, or from analog to digital in telephony. And in retrospect, they seem instantaneous. Horses to internal combustion, cars and so on. But if you lived through it, there would have been decades when there'd be a bit more of this and a bit less of that. And then it would be like, oh, they've just shut this or that facility.
The last horse-drawn hackney carriage in London, I think, was operating in 1937.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, there's also a thing, by the way, which is one thing marketers can teach everybody else, which is the Bass diffusion curve, which is adoption of any new technology as a sigmoid curve. By the way, where the top of that curve goes is not necessarily 100%. But the idea that people respond immediately to incentives, which I think slightly infects economics, simply isn't true. That large parts of human behavior are driven by two massive forces. I would argue they're evolutionary in origin, which are habit and social copying. And there's a very good reason why they might be evolutionary in origin, which is do what you've done before and do what everybody else does. May not be optimal, but they're quite good ways to avoid catastrophe.
We have seen in recent years what might be referred to as a kind of political and cultural backlash of sorts toward sustainability, climate change, ESG. There's certainly been a kind of correction, if you like, in the overarching narrative in the world today, driven by geopolitical forces of sorts, but not only. My question to you, Rory, is what has driven this backlash? Did the sustainability considerations, did we get them wrong? Why is it that there is this counter force of sorts, in your opinion?
It's reactance is the psychological term, and it's a consequence of three things, one of which is undoubtedly dark forces of manipulation that spread misinformation, for instance, about electric cars. I mean, what on earth has driven the entire focus on range in the electric car industry? Strikes me as slightly weird. Nobody ever talked about the range of their petrol car. And there's not much difference, to be absolutely honest. It's irrelevant in a country like this, slightly different in the US. So dark forces of manipulation, which can seed narratives all over the place, and media owners which are highly receptive to these.
And when you say dark forces, you're sort of,
I mean
commercial entities
literally
that
manipulation. I mean, absolutely.
But to ensure that old technological plays remain commercially profitable for longer.
I'll give you an example of this. There are cases where the only way you can derive information from the media is by seeing its absence. Let me explain. I am sure there are lots of people at lots of certain media outlets who love anti-electric car stories. I mean, I wrote pro-electric car writing in The Telegraph, for example, and the comment section turns into carnage. So there's a kind of clickbaity story about massive queues and fights breaking out around electric car chargers, Now, what I always do is I go to those newspapers like The Telegraph, and when I see those stories not appearing, it's very, very hard evidence that problem isn't happening. Because there's no anti-story. I mean, media has a massive negativity bias. Bad news kind of sells.
Bad news is good news for an advert.
And also, bad news tends to be fast and good news tends to be slow, by the way. And that's a general rule that, if you look at most of the improvements that have happened over the last 20 or 30 years, there isn't a single inflection point where everybody goes, God, that used to be terrible and now it's great. Okay, whereas bad news tends to happen rapidly. And so in a culture of rolling news, there's massive negativity bias. Then there are two other things, one of which I think is justifiable in terms of a backlash, which is you can be right about the fundamental science, but wrong about the means you adopt to achieve the intended end.
Explain.
One of the things I massively enjoyed is your attack on hydrogen, which was that there are certain people who are absolutely convinced that hydrogen was the solution to everything. What Michael pointed out is it's a Swiss Army knife. It can do lots of different things, but it isn't actually very good at any of them. The third thing is simply that you have the right intentions, but you communicate them in a deeply unattractive way. For example, sanctimoniousness is a massive turn-off. That would be just one example.
Great. Michael, what did we get wrong?
So there's a few things going on. I think Rory's absolutely right. The dark forces, I would say dark forces, false prophets, which is the hydrogen one, and then sanctimoniousness. Absolutely, I'm going to go with those. Dark forces, I think the focus on range, I mean, it's partly dark forces, but there are much worse examples. And in fact, I discovered one. I came across one because I'm sad. On a Friday evening, there was a leaflet. An MP was involved, and there were various automotive companies that were promoting it, and it was produced by a think tank, and it said that actually electric cars may not be lower emission than fossil fuels. And in fact, there's other things like e-fuels, these incredibly expensive, sort of 10 times more expensive synthetic fuels, absurd non-solution. So I thought I'd find out who published this, who was the think tank, and discovered that it was produced by a company that had one director who was the wife of the government relations head of Aston Martin. The whole thing was astroturfed, the whole thing. And it was very interesting because there were PR companies promoting it involved, and none of them would sort of go on the record. They'd all signed all of the good things that get signed by PR companies about the climate, but still promoted this thing. So dark forces, absolutely. And you have all these people worrying about cobalt in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC, who have never given a damn about child labour in cobalt mines when the cobalt was going into their mobile phones, but they become enormously concerned when it's going into electric vehicles. And those people are, let's put it this way, they're not motivated by child labour, I'm afraid.
So a lot of people who hijack this particular issue essentially have used this as a platform through which to pursue some other ideal, one of which is, by the way, anti-consumerism. But by the way, I regard the anti-car movement as largely nonsensical.
Vastly smaller than the anti-electric car movement, which is a huge thing. I mean, the anti-car people occasionally sort of squeak a bit on social media at me because, and I have to say, oh yes, I believe in walking and active transport as well, which I do. And I've worked on very intensively. I was on the board of Transport for London doing it. But the false prophets, yes, the promotion of non-solutions. And then when it becomes clear that they're non-solutions, that attracts a lot of irritation. Gordon Brown pressing diesel as a climate solution, if you'll remember.
By the way, everybody right on in my childhood had a sticker on the back of their car which said, nuclear power, no thanks. Yeah. And everybody when I was at university who was left-wing had a sticker that said, support the miners. So you can't entirely blame people for being slightly sceptical about this.
Let me talk about where we are on the historical, because I want to get to the sanctimoniousness or the point of history that we reached. It's very interesting. We've reached peak emissions, plus or minus, right? We're about there. The UK has led the G20, the G7 has led everybody in decarbonising. But all of that progress in the UK, everywhere it's happened, has been essentially technocratic. No behaviour change required. You still switch the light on and the light goes on.
It's upstream.
It's invisible. But the next lot of decarbonisation actually requires behaviour change. It is changing your heating, changing your car, changing the equipment you use in your bakery. And suddenly, instead of just being able to capture a few politicians and having them make some changes to power regulation, you've actually got to persuade somebody to go and spend their summer, ripping out their boiler and putting in a heat pump. And it's really stupid to annoy the people whose behaviour you want to change.
So I really want to then focus on those people whose behaviour we need to change. They're subject to manipulation, dark forces, media bias, allergic to sanctimonious messages, but really what do you think is getting in the way? What annoys them, what loses them around the approach we're currently taking, and what do you think they're really looking for?
The way government approaches things is completely wacko because government is basically run by lawyers who occasionally talk to economists. Okay, and anybody else need not apply. So their default mode of intervention is start with compulsion. If that fails, try bribing people, and only then try asking people nicely. Now, okay, there's a degree of self-interest here. I come from the advertising industry, but I have to say, that's backwards, isn't it? You should see what you can achieve through voluntary action. Then if that fails, you should give people some money, and only then should you boss people around. And fundamentally, government has a legalistic mindset, also has an economic mindset as well, which has some terrible things, I think. For example, the single representative agent model in economics means you solve for the average, whereas nearly all progress starts at the edges, for instance. That would be just one example.
So how would you do it then?
I'll give you a very, very simple suggestion. One thing I think is fundamentally true about humans is that if you present them with any deal in which they are only a loser, unsurprisingly, people will respond badly. And I suspect the evolutionary reason for this is we see it almost as a diminution of our status, or, it's an insult. So this is not me. This is a former colleague of mine who was then the head of behavioural science at the Department of Transport. When they're introducing the 3p charge per mile for electric cars, his idea is you will get much more acceptance of that if there's a sweetener, which is you reduce VAT on public charging stations from 20% to 5%, which is what you pay at home. Now, a lot of people will take a quid pro quo if there's a bit of quid in exchange for the quo. Okay, what government often does is it comes in with something which there is no possible upside to it, and therefore there's no possible mechanism for the brain to frame it as no person in business would ever propose a deal with someone in which the other party was purely a loser. Okay, unless you're organised crime syndicate or something of that kind. Okay, but government does this all the time. It has no psychological creativity at all for the most part. If, by the way, the government had any clue about marketing, the higher rate of tax would be 39.9%.
Michael, from an electorate perspective, what's your diagnosis of why people are increasingly not on board, and what would your, I suppose, political prescription be for how we get support?
So having said that, we're at the point where we need people's active engagement because their behaviours are now having to change. We've also got going on in the background very high energy prices, which are actually driven by Russia's ghastly invasion of Ukraine. If you look at it, that's what's driven up energy prices far more than anything else. But those dark forces have successfully spun that as the consequence of climate action and net zero and so on, which is tragic. So we've got people genuinely economically stressed being directed at net zero and then being told that they're going to have their car banned, or the type of car that they like to use. They're going to have to rip out their boiler and replace it with something that's very expensive and actually drives up their utility bills because electricity costs are so high that they're not going to see a benefit of a heat pump. They're going to see their bills going up. And I think it's entirely unsurprising that they are saying no thanks at this point. And that needs to be unravelled.
So how do we get them to say, yes, please, or at least, yes, okay?
Well, so I think a lot of it is going to be about pushing down the cost of electricity. There are millions of homes right now, today, that could install a heat pump and they would get a better heating solution. More even. If they're running a boiler at a low flow temperature because they've got a decent insulation already, if they've got enough space, there are 25 million homes in the UK. I'm not saying all of them are ready. I'm just saying there's a few million that could today switch over and actually with lower bills, et cetera, et cetera. But does the policy focus on those? And you've got to focus on end of life. If I'm trying to get Rory, I'm going to give him £7,500 to rip out a perfectly good boiler. He's going to tell me where to stick the money, right? Whereas if I can give somebody maybe a much more modest amount of money because their boiler is making a funny noise and is going to collapse and they're worried about the winter anyway. So understanding end of life. And the other thing is, Rory, you talked about who politicians speak to. they never speak to heating engineers. No. That I guarantee you. You have all these people who they do PPE at Oxford, and then they become a SPAD, and then they become a councillor, and then they become an MP, and then they become a minister, and they have literally never had a conversation, most of them, with somebody who installs and adjusts boilers, or who, conversely, tries to install a heat pump and discovers that they need 15 different bits of paper and that it takes a week instead of a day. They just don't have that level of knowledge.
Moreover, they're all enthralled to the Treasury, which demands complete evidence of something before you do it, which creates a fairly severe problem because, by definition, there's no evidence about something new.
So, okay, we understand the problem. There's not enough engineers, scientists, and that type of thinking, or psychologically sensible people. That's the point. It's not happening. So the question is, we're looking to create a better future. How, in your estimation, can this phenomena change, where there's this disconnect between those that are making the decisions and the necessary engineering, psychology, and scientific input? So how do we shift that?
What happens, because you have these policymakers and regulators and investors who don't really understand what solutions look like because they don't have the energy systems knowledge and the STEM knowledge and so on, they grasp for magic solutions. So hydrogen will solve everything, right? And so then they spend an enormous amount of time, whole departments of government associated with the push for carbon capture and storage retrofitted to power stations, or whatever, e-fuels, these incredibly expensive fuels for aviation, or ammonia for shipping, being proposed by people who have never, ever been in the engine room of a ship to ask, what would it be like to have this toxic material in? So you get the magic solution thinking. Now, you ask, what's the solution? How do we move it? The first bit was saying the transition is not dead. It is happening. It is slow, progressive. It grows geometrically, or actually on a sigmoid curve, but it looks geometric to start with, etc. The second part of it was, how do you actually move this thing forwards? If you want it to go as quickly as possible, what do? You stop demonizing fossil fuels and you start focusing on growing the clean stuff. And what you do within that is you focus on what is cheap and right in front of your nose. You stop going for the magic solutions. You stop going for absolutism. So as an example of absolutism, if you demonize all use of gas, then you don't have a solution for the 1 or 2 weeks a year when there's no wind and sun. 1 or 2 weeks a year is 2 to 4% of the time. If we just use gas 2 to 4% of the time, that is so much better of an outcome than where we are today.
The similar analogy is with vaping, which was interesting because purists immediately sought to get it banned because they didn't like harm reduction as a strategy. They only had an absolutist everybody quits approach. And your point about, if you still use gas to effectively top up the thing, but it's at the level of sort of single digits.
Many of us have got kids. They're very, very clever. And if that's the problem we leave them, how to get rid of the last 2 or 4%.
Exactly.
That's a good thing to leave. It's a good patrimony to leave them with.
It's so much better than where we are.
So much better, yes.
Speed matters.
Absolutely.
And therefore proposing things which, for example, my late father would have installed a heat pump, but his argument was, I'm 85. Not a bad argument. So consequently, if you take an air-to-air heat pump, you can install it one room at a time, much more likely. By the way, there are also things which is that most people have absolutely no clue about the physics of electricity, in that, I know people with a degree who, somebody actually got very angry because one of their house guests charged a mobile phone overnight without asking for permission. But that same person wouldn't have been concerned if they'd put on a 3-bar electric fire, for instance. Now, what I'm literally saying this, that there are obviously solutions which require some degree of education here. Now, you can do this in 2 ways. You can either educate people about the fundamental physics, or you can use analogies. And one of the points I make about electric cars is that once a year or 2 or 3 times a year, your electric car produces its own advertisement for its energy efficiency, which is the snow on the bonnet doesn't melt. Okay, so you'll literally see a station car park where the electric cars still have snow on the bonnet, and all the petrol cars, it's all melted because of the waste heat. That is itself a beautiful demonstration. by the way. One obvious benefit of an electric car, which nearly nobody has clocked, is that it can run off any fuel, whereas a petrol car can only run off fuel that's generally controlled by a few people in a war zone somewhere. Okay? Now, the analogy I use to explain that is that trains in the United States in the 19th century, they headed east burning coal. And as they got further west, they switched from coal to lumber because coal was less abundant. The second point is, I'll tell you a little story, which was I did this thing which went viral, which was just imagine if all cars were electric and someone invented the gasoline engine. People would think they were completely insane. Now, what was delightful about that was on Friday, I was catching a train and a couple came up to me and the guy said, thanks ever so much. She said, because I'm off to buy a Tesla at Bluewater. And the reason is because I showed my wife your film. Okay? And fundamentally, storytelling, analogies, education.
I have to give Rory another example of that. I want you to use this one.
Okay, no.
Imagine you woke up and there were no parked cars in the streets of London. And you had all of this road space and you had to decide what to do with it. You could do pocket parks. You could do little bits of housing. You could have we could have bus lanes. Yeah. You could have bike lanes. You could have filter left lanes. You could have cafes, could put chairs out. You could do all sorts of things. Would you give the vast majority of it to a certain segment of the population to park their assets 96% of the time?
Incidentally, the business that as a resident, you effectively get to rent something like £100,000 worth, £200,000 worth of real estate for sort of £100 a year.
So given the diagnosis that you laid out earlier, is we are now in the space of having to focus on behaviour change. We're going to have to get people to change their behaviours. What I want to know is, do you think there are any unsellable truths? Are there any spaces where actually you think we are going to have to get to that kind of hard stick at the end? Or are we going to pragmatically make our way through this messy space by good stories, good incentives?
I think what we ought to do, I can tell you which bits sort of make no sense from an energy system perspective, or at least can't be made economically viable, so that they just, so there's a chunk of solutions which right now are flying off the shelves because they make sense economically, physically, economically, and also they're cheaper and the benefits go to the user so that they can finance them or just pay for them themselves. There's another chunk of solutions where that will happen soon because the costs are coming down, or the benefits might pop up somewhere else. So it's a finance problem, because if you can somehow route the benefits back to the person buying the thing. And then there's a bunch of things, and these are the really hard ones, where they'll never become cheaper. So as an example, high temperature heat. So if you've got low temperature heat in a factory, you're trying to dry some food, or you're trying to cook something at whatever normal temperatures, up to about 200 degrees heat and steam. You will do all of that. All of it will go to heat pumps because they're so efficient. Their coefficient of performance, you get kind of free energy out of the air or out of water. When you get to high temperature heat, right, then you can't use a heat pump. It just doesn't go to those higher temperatures. But if you want to do, let's say, ceramics, and you just need a high temperature, then gas is just so cheap. And doing it electrically probably will cost more. Where I'm going is you will need either a carbon price or something clever that Rory could come up with that could persuade people to pay a lot more for those ceramics because they're made with unicorn dust-driven electricity or something, right?
Yeah, you're learning.
So, Rory, are you confident that there is always going to be a sell for some of those more expensive things?
A very simple thing. I've made this point before, but range anxiety in electric cars has two components, range and anxiety. And it's perfectly right that literally $1 trillion is being spent trying to increase the energy density of batteries to increase range. But it might be a hell of a lot cheaper in the short term to reduce anxiety. And that literally might involve going to Google, giving them £500,000 or whatever it might be, and saying, when you use Android Auto or Apple CarPlay, your enormous screen in your electric car will always display what high-speed rapid chargers are available within a 10-mile radius, so you don't feel worried anymore.
So we're doing this. I have a company that I've incubated called Pragmacharge, which is big rig HGVs, electrically, right? Electric trucks, but 40-ton plus. And we're delivering electric freight, so clean freight, cheaper than diesel, without subsidies today. So operating already, got a few trucks in Spain. We've got other locations rolling out. And how we do it is software. Right? Because what you need to do is identify the bits of the freight kind of network where the truck is doing enough kilometers per year so that you can go electric. Because expensive truck, cheap fuel, you need to do lots of kilometers.
Yes.
You identify it using software and you manage it using software. We are doing exactly what you're talking about to reduce the anxiety of the dispatcher and the driver that they're going to be stuck with a truck full of pallets of whatever. The first thing we do is look for what we call pulsars. So these are locations where lots of trucks go out and back. And they're doing enough kilometers out and back, out and back, out and back, a few times a day, 500-600 kilometers a day. If you find that pulsar location, you need one charging location. And then you can go for corridors. You can have a pulsar at each end, and suddenly you can go from one end of a corridor to the other. And then you build out a network, sort of profitable leg at a time, profitable hub at a time. So the point is, it's software. It's software.
Now, interestingly, also, one of the things you simply have to accept is that how you present information or data affects how people respond to it. And if you can put an inset on the screen at this point of the podcast showing the paceometer, which is developed by two Israeli behavioral scientists, I think Eyal Peer is one of them, that shows an alternative to a speedometer, but the other way around.
How long it takes to do 100 kilometres?
10 miles.
Yes.
It's minutes per 10 miles.
Yes.
And it's extraordinarily revelatory because, first of all, you realise that if you're already going 60 or 70 miles an hour, the time saving you get for any non-intercontinental journey becomes basically trivial, even though energy consumption is going up exponentially. I showed it to Nassim Taleb, who said, this is interesting because it's mathematically trivial, but it's completely counterintuitive. Yes. We tend to think an extra 10 miles an hour will save us the same amount of time, regardless of how fast we're going already. It's sort of asymptotic almost, okay? And by the way, Einstein got one of these questions wrong. So it's not something where you just go, the public are thick. It was only when I looked at the paceometer and been presenting it for literally sort of a year, I presented every time I present, because I think it could save someone's life. Yeah. It basically says going really fast is an idiot's game. I suddenly realised, of course, why the bicycle was such a monumentally important invention. Yeah. Because in terms of miles per hour, it's 4 times as fast as walking, let's say. Okay. In terms of where you can meaningfully go in a day's journey, it's a complete transformation. You know, your range of operations is totally transformed. And so I suddenly became massively sympathetic to what you might call low-speed transportation. Now, the interesting thing is if you think about it, a mile a minute and 10 minutes to go 10 miles are exactly the same speed to a physicist. But how you present that scale...
I want to come back to one of the things you talked about at the outset around the dark forces, misinformation. You've also been clear that if we suppress criticism, it backfires. Or if we have exaggerated claims or scenarios, it really erodes credibility and we're not in the space of what's practically possible. But we can also see that in some places we've got deliberate misinformation.
Signalling value is often the enemy of solution value. Now, Michael, rightly criticised all these people who've studied PPE. Now, what PPE tells you to do is how to win an argument. How to win an argument and how to solve a problem require totally different mind spaces.
That's politics, philosophy and economics.
It's the École Nationale d'Administration of the UK, effectively. A lot of people in politics have studied this particular thing.
Huge proportion of British prime ministers.
And, of course, the journalists who cover them in many cases, too.
So,
which makes it
I
even
want
worse.
to know, how do we have legitimate debate without that being captured, misunderstood, given that you've said how hard it is? Does it matter that we have space for legitimate
One thing that really appeals to me, to you as a physicist and me as a marketer, is Saul Griffith's Australian guy, which is also means I rank him upwards massively, because Australian thinking is a bit like Australian fauna. Because it's kind of evolved in isolation, it's actually much more interesting than what you get in in large land masses.
I thought you were going to say that it's almost certainly fatal if you try and pick it up.
But his great thing is electrify everything.
Tim Minchin, I mean, he alone is worth emigrating.
It's worth emigrating for. Completely agree. And so there's that independence of thought, which I find, and actually, of course, if you want another place to go to as a beacon for the energy transition, it's Texas, fantastically, isn't it? Which is not what you would have predicted. That's what I'm saying.
Well, I'm interested. How do we foster that independence of thought?
Electrify everything is interesting to me because it seems to be completely valid in terms. It's a heuristic. It's not absolutely perfect, but it seems to be mentally comprehensible and at the same time actually chimes very well with what we understand about physics.
You've heard of, I think, my hydrogen ladder, which is the things that you should do with hydrogen, which is very few at the top, and the things you absolutely shouldn't do, which is at the bottom. I'm launching the electrification staircase.
Perfect.
What is already happening in electrification and what is about to happen and what is actually going to happen, but only in a few decades. So a very, very simple heuristic. It's not electrify everything, but it's electrify this huge chunk of the economy, but in some rational and pragmatic, I'm doing air quotes for those listening on the podcast.
The signaling thing also tends to lead to hair-shirtedness, which is there's a weird middle-class left-wing person. You find them in universities and you find them in big cities. Okay, and I think universities and big cities are fundamentally insane because you get hyper-competition among people who are very, very similar in status, who are then driven to points of insanity to demonstrate their commitment to one. By the way, in rural areas, you'll find massive interest in heat pumps and the conversation will be totally pragmatic and sensible.
I'm spending quite a lot of time in corporate boards and exec teams, and I'm hearing for the first time real scepticism that even climate change is a thing. So some of this kind of polarised debate is cutting through. So I'm interested how to be engaged, constructively but pragmatically without then seeding this, we should just all give up.
Because I have a big STEM background, let me just say, for anybody listening to this who might be saying, well, it's really not happening. It is happening, right? Climate change is real. Humans cause pretty much all of it. And we know that now because when we stopped using low-grade shipping fuel, then it suddenly accelerated because we saw the impact of the greenhouse gases that we'd put into the atmosphere. So humans are causing pretty much all of it, and we have the tools to address it. We can, over a period of many decades, transition away from the things that are causing it. So first point is it's real, it's happening, and nobody should be any doubt, right? But part of informing those people is also to move away from the exaggeration of climate change, right? Because the people who really want action on climate change have moved to the extreme as well. And
like kind of alarmist rhetoric.
I fought long and hard against the use of a scenario called RCP 8.5. To get very technical, the UN, the IPCC, which is the bit of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that reviews the science every sort of 6 or 7 years, for the sake of convenience and shorthand, they said, right, let's look at 4 or 5 different scenarios rather than have everybody work on their own scenario, so we could compare between them. And the most extreme one that they designated has this name, RCP 8.5. It was proven in 2017 that there is not enough coal on the planet to drive the atmosphere along this scenario, this pathway, RCP 8.5. And yet, today, there is research produced every day, you can go to Google Scholar and you can find it, that uses this scenario and essentially says, if we don't do these extreme things, banning this and banning your boiler and banning the car and so on and so on, if we don't do that, then that's where we're headed. And it is literally physically impossible for us to get there. So there's extremes on both sides. And the problem with, the people who want action on climate change, they are very well-meaning. But what they've got is a theory of change that says, the more you scare people, the more likely they are to act. And if you have to kind of shade the science or exaggerate or stick yourself to the Shell headquarters, the problem is that's not spurring action. Just look around. That is not. So what you've got is the pushback. Yeah. To a certain extent, it's yin and yang, or action and reaction, or reactiveness, psychological reaction. You're being told to do something which is behavioral change, which is difficult, which might not be profitable in your world, right? And you're being told it by people who, when you poke the science, you find they're exaggerating it.
Are we saying, in terms of communicating to the public and to those that have the ability to make change, we're saying the following: everybody, can we move away from scaring people into the change? Okay, the change is absolutely urgent. It is absolutely necessary. It's all real. But the way we've got to do this is not create terror to get the change. The way we have to do this is, and finish the sentence for me.
Something happened which is strange, and you see the rise of the abundance movement in the United States as a countervailing force to this, which is people on the left seem to have got into their heads, and it's a middle-class left-wing thing, which is effectively, you can't have nice things, okay, right? The focus has been on self-denial and regulation, neither of which is particularly attractive. Now, interestingly, one of the points I'd make is it doesn't matter if someone does the right thing for the wrong reasons, okay? Marketing, we don't really care why someone buys something. Now, in the same way, there is no correlation between electric car ownership and care for the environment. Most people buy electric cars because they like the technology or because they're better cars. There is not all progress, but an enormous amount of progress can be made voluntarily, and therefore we should reserve people's self-denial for things where self-denial is required. A large part of this can be sold on the basis of abundance. I've argued, that there are really clever behavioral science tricks you can play here. For example, if you get a lump sum pension payment, you could actually sell solar as an energy pension. Effectively, rather than putting your money in an annuity and then getting a certain amount of money, you put your money into technology and you get a reduction. 25, 30 years ago, I tried to sell the idea of a broadband pension. You pay more for your broadband, but then once you reach a certain age, it's free. Okay, and I thought a certain number of people would do that. Okay. Now, I think there are loads of ways you need to look at people's individual circumstances. What are the moments in which you can reasonably ask people to take these actions? It always interests me that there may be self-interested ways in which we can actually help the climate, which never get promoted because people are more interested in selling self-sacrifice because it has more signalling value.
So what we've got in front of us is a huge number of solutions that are either economic or nearly economic.
Or both. Psychoeconomic.
Or have a lot of other benefits. So, for instance, if you cook electrically, you reduce the risk of asthma for your children. So anybody who wants to push against the electrification, those are the politically they would be the asthma candidates. We should call them that. But there's a whole bunch of solutions that make sense, that don't cost more, may cost less, and we should focus policy on those rather than on promoting non-solutions and expensive solutions and trying to do the difficult stuff first.
Most of our audience as an institute of Investec is the private sector, is not government. And we're talking a lot about policy solutions. I'm interested in what your advice would be to those in the private sector about how they can either take action directly and get buy-in for that, or how they can be effective in creating the market conditions to move down this pragmatic pathway.
I have one word to say to you, which is electrification. Electrification is where this whole battlefield is going to move over the next decade and a half, 2 decades. So the electrification staircase, because it's going to look a bit different from the hydrogen ladder, I would take that, I would study it, and if you're in business, use that as a roadmap for what to do next.
I think some areas of the economy should be exempt from concern on this. Now, I've never understood the eco setting on my dishwasher because it seems to save a paltry amount of water, which, given that I'm in the UK, is most of the year is irrelevant, and an irrelevant amount of electricity, but it means the thing takes 4 hours to wash my dishes and doesn't do a very good job. And the fact that your printer goes into standby mode so that every time you print a document, you have to wander into the next room. Those things strike me as intensely annoying because they annoy the consumer without making any... Steven Pinker famously apologized because he got involved in a student movement which was make sure your phone charger's turned off when you're not charging your phone. Those are things which have a large amount of signalling value. They signal you care, but actually it's like pissing in the Pacific. It makes absolutely no difference. Reserve people's goodwill for those things where they can really make a difference.
The other thing I would say is whether you're an individual or whether you're a business, How about this for a very simple rule to do exactly what Rory's saying, focusing on the stuff that matters? Don't buy another burner. Whether that burner is another internal combustion car, or whether it's a boiler, or if you're in business, whether it's a baking oven or a commercial boiler or steam production, just when it reaches the end of its life, buy an electric version of whatever it was. You'll do it once. It's a bit of a pain in the backside because you'll have to maybe make some changes and do a bit of research and maybe even pay a bit more, but you will be done.
My support for electric cars, I actually know Jeremy Clarkson. I think he's brilliant, but I think he's wrong about one thing. He got out of car reviewing because he said with electrification, cars had become boring. But if you extend that to transportation and you include electric scooters, you include cargo bikes, what we're seeing is a Cambrian explosion of innovation that can happen in the electric sphere, which could never happen in the petrol sphere. A good business strategy, any good strategy, optimizes for optionality. And the electric motor brings us optionality. The burner, we've reached the end of the road in terms of innovation. In electrification, we haven't.
And at that point, thank you, Michael and Rory, for joining us today. That has been such a great conversation. Join us next time on What Next? Leadership Conversations for a Better Future.
This show is presented by Lindsay Hooper, Chief Executive of CISL, and Mark Kahn, Investec's Chief Strategy and Sustainability Officer. The producers are Carl Homer of Cambridge TV and Alexa Selwood. The executive producer is Gillian Secret, and it's produced in partnership with Investec. Thank you for listening. For more episodes, subscribe on any major podcast platform or visit the Leadership Hub on the CISL website or Investec Focus. You'll find the address in the show notes.